The African National Congress condemns the recent acts of aggression directed at the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which constitutes a serious violation of international law, national sovereignty, and the principles governing peaceful relations between states.
Hello, folks. Welcome back. The hypocrisy of South Africa's ruling African National Congress has been on full display for the world to see this week as it responds and reacts to President Trump's raid on Caracas to capture the wanted narco-terrorist accused, Nicolas Maduro, who stole elections. Well, there's been lots of responses, but let's listen in to President Ramaphosa as he talks a couple of times about South Africa's position and its demands and how it demands the United States release Maduro, as well as how they stand with the people of Venezuela. It's fascinating to hear him talk about how they stand with the people of Venezuela. Which people are you talking about? As Venezuelans in exile around the world celebrated the removal of Nicolas Maduro. But let's listen to what Ramaphosa has to say.
It is our commitment to international law and the United Nations Charter that informs our deep concern and action of the United States in Venezuela, which has undermined the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a UN member state called Venezuela. We reject utterly the actions that the United States has embarked upon and stand with the people of Venezuela. And we demand the release of President Maduro and his wife as well. We reiterate our call for decisive action by the United Nations Security Council to fulfill its mandate and advance peace and security.
International law. Would that be the international law and the United Nations Security Council sanctions and rules that South Africa has violated, such as allowing its defense firms to ship war material to a sanctioned Libyan war leader more than once, repeatedly, being arms dealers to tyrants around the world? Is that the international law that he's referring to? Interesting how selective the African National Congress is when it comes to these sort of things. Now, of course, famously, back in 2018, South Africa's ambassador Nkosi to Venezuela said the most outrageous things about the United States and said that we'll raise an army to go there. Of course, we've seen South Africa's army. Here it is in the Congo, surrendering to M23 just a few months ago, a group of rebels, shaming and embarrassing the South African National Defense Force. The once vaunted defense force, the most powerful in Africa and one of the best disciplined, trained, and successful on the entire planet just 3 decades ago, reduced to this sad spectacle. And that's what we're being threatened with here as they demand the release. Interesting. As if that wasn't enough, of a follow-up conversation with the press, Ramaphosa simply doubled down on his previous comments.
Well, I think everybody now in the world agrees that what has happened is a violation of international law and also a violation of the United Nations Charter. And that is why we called for the Security Council to meet to discuss this matter. And they are the one body that is mandated by the entire world to deal with issues of peace, to deal with issues of security. And we are hoping that the collective wisdom that resides in the Security Council and in the UN body as a whole will bring forward solutions and bring to bear some good sense that should prevail. Because what has happened now basically is giving carte blanche to anyone to mount an invasion on any country. And clearly that cannot be something that we are all pleased with. But the Security Council, as well as the United Nations, must deal with the matter. So they are best placed to address this matter.
This silly, empty-headed virtue signaling accomplishes nothing other than to distract from the domestic woes of the African National Congress's electoral woes and the collapsing society in South Africa where crime runs rampant, gangsters rule the roost, kidnappings for profit are rampant, carjackings, murders, gender-based violence, infrastructure collapsing, the world's worst performing ports, you name it. 40% unemployment, 34 million people living in abject poverty, triple the number of black South Africans living in poverty than under the National Party. This is a party that for decades has blamed Jan van Riebeck, colonialism, apartheid, and Hendrik Verwoerd for their failures. And while certainly at the outset, at the start, much of that situation can be blamed on the past government, 31 years later, it's all the fault of the ANC and its foolish, stupid, failed leftist macroeconomic policies and its racist legislation. And that's the bottom line here. They cannot take responsibility for their own failures, so they seek to distract by now turning in the Jan card for a Trump card. That's what they want to do. Turn in the Jan van Riebeck card for a Donald Trump card and blame Donald Trump for all the failures of South Africa. And much like the little dog, the Chihuahua, yapping at the neighbor, they're not getting much attention.
The kidnapping of Comrade President Nicolas Maduro, his wife, Comrade Celia Flores, and son, Nicolas Ernesto Maduro, undermines the United Nations Charter and threatens global peace and stability at a time when the world requires cooperation, restraint, and dialogue.
Former South African ambassador to Argentina, Tony Leon, who helped put together the early days of the Democratic Alliance, now in league and in coalition with the ANC in the government of national unity. But Leon wasn't part of that. He did serve as ANC's ambassador to Argentina, however. He said just how disliked Maduro, whose Chavista regime has reduced South America's once wealthiest economy to beggary and replaced its once robust democracy with a thuggish autocracy, was revealed in 2025. He stole the rigged presidential election in brazen fashion. Tally sheets indicate the opposition won 80% of the vote, yet he stayed in office. The UN recently released a report detailing more than a decade of killings, torture, sexual violence, and arbitrary detention against his political opponents. Clearly, for brother President CR, the promise of the Freedom Charter that the people will govern was not written for export. Ambassador Tony Leon. Now, to be fair, Ambassador Leon also took President Trump to task for what he calls a kidnapping. Wrong. Sorry, was not a kidnapping. It was an extradition for a criminally charged person. Impossible to arrange through the government of Venezuela because Venezuela was a rogue regime and therefore unable to extradite him that way. So you can quibble about how they did it, but the bottom line is this was a lawful extradition. While Ramaphosa, Fikile Mabulula, and other ANC officials continue to squawk, they run the risk of putting themselves into the crosshairs of Donald Trump, who has clearly shown that realism in international relations theory is the dominant theory in effect today. The namby-pambyism of the 1990s, the lost, wayward decades when governments refused to assert their sovereignty and allowed themselves to be walked over, is coming to an end. But it's always been that way. Ramaphosa talking about we're allowing the world to descend into some sort of chaos is utter nonsense. For decades, countries have invaded their neighbors with nary a word from the international community and no action. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, and for once the international community stood up because George Bush led the world, but because an American did it, and then he was evicted. The Chinese invaded Vietnam in 1979. The world did nothing. The Chinese invaded Korea in 1950. The world did nothing. South Africa invaded Lesotho in 1998, and no one outside SADC even noticed. South Africa has invaded the Comoros on so-called peacekeeping missions 5 times in the last 2 decades, and the world has paid no attention, no never mind. Tanzania invaded Uganda in 1979 to evict a murderous regime using unilateral action. Vietnam invaded Cambodia in the 1970s to stop Pol Pot from murdering Cambodians. The world said virtually nothing. As a rebel force organized and supported by none other than the tyrant Yoweri Museveni under Paul Kagame, entered Rwanda as the slaughter was ongoing and chased the genocideers into the Congo, no one objected to his actions. That was unilateral action on the part of Vietnam into Cambodia, of Tanzania into Uganda, and of Rwandans based in Uganda into Rwanda. all of which the world had no issue with. This selective attention and hearing of President Ramaphosa will not go well for him. Instead of barking at the United States, perhaps he should pay attention to domestic issues taking place in this country where people are going hungry, there are no jobs, and the anger is palpable. What say you, South Africa? Mzansi? Cheers.